couple minutes to say, what did we talk about the first 2 sessions, and what have we kind of gathered, and that sort of thing. Chuck helped us define significance as the quality of having notable worth or influence. And I think the notable worth idea is not necessarily connected to financial wealth. Worth and wealth are not synonymous. The idea of influence is really important in the definition as well, as we talked about last time. And then the precepts. What Chuck did was to say, okay, what are the 4 foundational points? The first one is one that I think got all of our attention. You can't get there, which is where. You can't get to significance if you make it about yourself. And especially in the earlier years, we probably all went through that challenge a little bit. We don't want to make it about ourselves. This one I've highlighted because it's going to be our discussion point jump off for today. And that is, to be significant, we have to have a set of core values that inform every decision you make. And notice the choice of the verb that Chuck made there, and that is the word inform, or the verb inform. What does it mean to have a value that informs the decision that you make? Okay, think about that, why that was chosen. Third precept. Life is meant to be lived relationally, and I put the sub-point, the bullet in on that we talked about 2 weeks ago, and that is that relationships that we sometimes view as our greatest liability are really our greatest assets. And so that's number 3. And number 4, do something that is worth giving your life to. And it gets back to this idea of work, and it gets back to the idea of your journey and your end game and your passion, and you're giving your life in what kind of sense. We all know what missionaries do. We all know what Jim Elliot did. Actually gave his physical life for it. But to be significant are the areas where you can actually give your life to something that may not necessarily be connected to your work. Okay? So those are 4 precepts. And then let's begin to core values a little bit. Chuck, what do we have? You want to cover this one? Want me to? Yeah. Okay.
Okay, core values. You hear a lot of people talking about core values, particularly with companies, and you all in your companies have gone through that and everything. But a lot of people don't think so much about personal core values. But core values are the fundamental beliefs of a person or an organization. The core values are the guiding principles that dictate behavior and action. They define who you are. They're like an umbrella under which everything else in your life is. Values are the basis of your character, your actions, your attitudes, your ethics, and your personal beliefs. And I've worked with a lot of people over the last 40-some years, and helping them clarify really direction in their life and what their sense of, these days I call it your inner GPS. What's that directional setter in your life that keeps us on track of where we need to go? And the more we have clarity about our personal core values, then we know that sense of rightness or wrongness about things that come our way. A core value sets direction for our lives and informs the decisions we make. Embracing a core value usually comes at a price. Embracing a core value usually comes at a price. And we'll share a few things as we go along. But I wanted to give you a couple of examples in a moment of what our own personal core values are. But I'm going to ask Rich to go ahead and talk about what a core value is not.
I think I talked to a couple of you and mentioned what was coming up. And, I've really always thought about core values in terms of a positive value that you have that sets direction for you in a positive way. But as I began to dialogue on this with Chuck, Chuck the Sage pointed out that I was not going down the right track on that, because we have core values that are really not core values. We think we have beliefs that are not core values. So let's try to unpack that a little bit, Chuck. We have really a set of 4 examples of values or maybe beliefs that really don't constitute core values. And what might those be? First one is a belief or value that does not travel from our head to our heart. I believe in the equality of all people. I think that's a noble goal, and I'm glad that a lot of people in the world take that on as a life mission. I mean, I believe in that. I just don't really act on it. It's not travel from my head to my heart. Okay. So if you have a belief or a value that doesn't travel to your heart, so it doesn't find its way into your actions and your convictions, then the question is whether or not that's a core value. That's something you think about. Number two, a characteristic we admire in others. I mean, I really admire the people that go to Africa, and I really admire the people that are on the Mercy Ship Hope that will spend 6 months to 18 months giving up everything they have here in this country and serving others in Africa. I really admire that. That isn't for me. So if that's my mindset, is that a core value of me, or do I have compassion as a core value? Just asking you to think about it. This is one that hit hard a little bit and hit home. A core value is not measured by other people's expectations. How much of what we do, this is something my mother pointed out to me once, that are you driven by what other people want you to do, or what you expect what other people think you ought to do, or are you driven by what's in your heart? And she had a way of pointing that out to me on occasion, and she was right. And so a core value is not measured by other people's expectations of you, which may drive what you do. Okay? A core value is not an ideal we endorse unless we live it out. I think it's great what World Mission does, and I'm just speaking, theoretically in a way, but World Mission or UMCOR, I think it's great, and it's great that they raise money, and it's great that other people contribute to UMCOR and World Vision and solve those problems. It's great that people go over and deal with tidal waves and everything else, all the other problems, but that's someone else's deal. Well, that's great, that's not a problem, but you need to think about that when you decide what your core values are. And so these are the sorts of things we want you to think about, because you're going to get a homework sheet here in a minute. We're going to ask you to give some serious thought to what your core values are, because really where we want to take this discussion is, once you make a determination as to honestly what core values you have, then how do we take those as a group then, and maybe mold those, or maybe enhance those, or maybe adopt another core value, and we then get to the discussion point that we're going to have here in a minute, and that is there a core value, once you now understand maybe what is not a core value, is there a core value that opposes what you want to do in life? Is there a core value that you have that opposes your journey to significance? Points on what a core value is not. And this is important right here. Some core values support our journey to significance, and that's what the journey means. Some core values oppose. As I mentioned before, a lot of people are driven, I think we all are driven, at least in part, by other people's expectations, aren't we? There are some people that are modeled more as pleasers, and there's nothing wrong with that. But is that a core value, and would that oppose a journey to significance in some area of your life? So once we get, we're not going to do collective core values as groupies. You really can't do that. But once you get a handle on what your core values are, then I think we're going to ask you to at least give some thought into splitting those into the values that support your journey and the values that oppose your journey.
Yeah, one writer put it this way. He says, your personal core values are there to guide behavior and choice. Get them right, and you'll be swift and focused in your decision-making with clear direction. Get them wrong, or leave them ambiguous, and you'll constantly wonder how you got into this mess. Then, it's just amazing the various different people I've met with over the years, and sometimes people don't even begin to think about who they really are and what's really the driving forces into the life till they are in a mess. And they're thinking, how in the world did I get here? And it's like, oh yeah, I was kind of being true to what was going on inside, but it wasn't doing me very well. And so that's then how you begin to unpack that and to do that. I know in my life, 45 years ago, I was making a decision in college what I was going to do with the rest of my life. And all of us have been there at various different junctures in your life. But a core value that I really clarified at that point in my life was I said, and it's just amazing, you know, how time becomes, you readjust your sense of time. Because back then in college, when I said in 45 years I want to look back, well, now at 45 years out, it's like, well, I want to expand that out just a little bit further. But I was thinking, 40, 50 years out, when I look back on my life, one of the things that I want to see is I want to see that my life has impacted other people's lives. So I want to invest my life in something that's making a difference in people's lives. And that really has been a core value in my life that has shaped many of the decisions that I've made. Some of them have involved a lot of difficult personal choices to make an impact in other people's lives, because if you choose to make an impact in other people's lives, oftentimes it's not convenient when they're impactable, if you know what I mean. People have needs, they have issues going on in their life, a lot of different things, and so that really then began to play into a thing of, and we'll talk about this later on, but the whole thing of self-sacrifice and how you get there. So that was a key core value for me that has developed over. I clarified way back when, but I've kind of refined that as I've gone along over the years, and that core value has served me well. Another one that has served me well, and I actually learned it when I was a kid. My mom used to say, any job that's worth doing is worth doing right. And so if I heard that once as growing up, I heard it quite a few times. And then I got into my career and pursuing what God was leading in my life. And then I began to get familiar with what the Bible says about God expects our best. And there's been so many opportunities over the years to go the cheap and dumb route, or economy of effort and cut corners. And yet that always came back to me that any job that's worth doing, if I'm going to glorify God, is worth doing right. And I've had things where I've had to tear things out because I realized that I didn't give it my best, and that wasn't honoring to God. And I had to go back just for the sole purpose of making it right before God, because I knew that He saw what I was doing, and it was unto Him. So those shape our core values as we go along. And I know, Rich, you've had the same thing as you've clarified things over the years.
Before I get to what I think is, and I've got a core value that's opposed my journey to significance, and it's one that I struggle with to this day. But let's talk about Kevin Don quote a little bit. He's saying, get a core value wrong or leave it ambiguous, and you'll constantly wonder how you got into this mess. I want you to think about that for a minute. Can we have what we think is a core value, yet we leave it ambiguous? What is he getting at? Can you help me unpack that a little bit? What do you think Kevin Don is getting at? If you have what you think is a core value and you're leaving it ambiguous and you end up getting into a mess. Has he got a point there? Thoughts?
Yeah, you end up involved in a project you should never be involved in. It's over your head and you're overwhelmed in it.
Okay, because you're saying, Chrissy, you say we say yes to things where maybe we're not gifted or equipped because we want people to like us, and so we get into something we, not equipped to do, basically. Okay, and so we have not acted on a core value and maybe said no when we should have said no. Okay, another example of where we can leave a core value ambiguous.
Richard, the thought comes to mind that when you're trying to be all things to all people, trying to please everybody, that you end up compromising your values or your principles, and in the end, you tend to not satisfy anybody.
Yeah, I think that's where I think my mind goes when I think of what he talks there about being ambiguous with the core values. We talked about it's a value that informs the decision that you make, and I want to go back to the use of that verb for a minute here, because if you have a value that informs the decision that you make, it really influences the decision you make, and it drives the decision that you make, does it not? And so that's why I'm saying when you get your list, I would really want you to think about a core value you may have that informs or drives the decision that you have that maybe does not push you down the path of significance. And for me, it's competitiveness. I mean, from the very beginning, whatever I was in, I wanted to win, and I did that in sports, and I still do that in sports, unfortunately, and I do that in the law. I never wanted to lose a case, and and so I think a core, I don't want to admit it, but the more I look at this, a core value is competitiveness, which opposes my dream to significance. And I fight that all the time. That's why I chose the humility topic later in the series to talk about. So, the more I wanted to be the best, I wanted to be a winner, I wanted to make the historical society the best historical society in the state. I mean, that's all driven from a core value I have to be competitive. And that is not something that supports my journey to significance. It might or it could, but it's a value with which I struggle, because embedded in this idea of being competitive is the idea that if I'm competitive and I win all my races next summer, it's about me. It's about what I did, and you see that gets you down in pride. And as I'll unpack later on when we talk about humility. I mean, for 54 years I thought pride was the greatest thing in the world, because that was ambition, that was success, that was achievement. And when I started my faith journey 12 years ago, I learned that pride was a deadly sin. I was like, what? And I just was really shocked at that. And I was so far off the path. I wasn't on any path to significance. So my deal is to try to take this core value and to really think about that and not let it oppose my journey to significance, but use it to support my journey to significance. So I've got a value there with which I struggle with that supports some things I do, but also opposes my journey to significance. And that's what I look at. Bruce.
Rich, I think you're addressing that, if I get them right or wrong. I think the other part of that definition is leaving them ambiguous. And I think the ambiguity comes in a core value if you try to demonstrate a core value that you think you have in your personal life, but yet when you get into your business environment, all of a sudden you leave some of those core values behind and abandon them, or else forget about them and traveling from your heart to your head because we think we need to act differently in a business environment with a different core value there than what the core values we have in our personal life, and that's where the ambiguity comes in what is my personal core value. Because it needs to transcend all of those four areas that you highlighted earlier, if it is a true core value.
Absolutely. Boy, that's a great point. You want to speak on that, Chuck? Transcending the four areas.
Well, and I see that all the time. I've worked with a lot of guys who really get in terms of real conflict because in the 17 years that I worked with military folks, and particularly with the military, because politics oftentimes is involved in what administration is currently reigning. And I've had some guys who were outstanding in their character, and yet oftentimes were forced into situations, or they thought they were being forced into situations to compromise things. And particularly, I was working in San Diego with the fleet down there, and some guys as they were out, and before an aircraft carrier or any major ship goes out to sea for deployment, a lot of people don't understand why the stress is so much on these folks. But they spend 6 months in workups before they ever go on the deployment. And those workups, they're out to sea sometimes during the week, all during the week. They come home on the weekends. And so they're out there, and they have to meet certain performance criteria that are pretty severe in terms of their standards. And it's easy sometimes when they have a skipper or a department head who they're pretty close to being where the standards say, but they're not quite there. And it's easy to begin to make things look better than what they are. And that happens in business all the time, doesn't it? And that puts us sometimes into a moral crisis. And we're going to talk about that in a few moments. But I think that's very, very important for us to understand that, like Bruce said, and I think your point, Bruce, is so excellent, is that we've got to know what those are and allow them to permeate in every area of our life.
Anybody ever been in a similar situation, not Bruce was identifying a situation, just have you all been there where you start out Monday and you're pretty set, you know what your core values are, but by about Wednesday you've been into a lot of situations, especially at work, where you're wondering whether or not you applied your core values? Okay, that's really the kingdom versus the secular world. It really is. Worldviews. What's the worldview? We'll get into that at some point as well. Let's go to the next one here, because I think there are a couple of principles. We want to identify core values. I shared one that I really think opposes my journey and I'm working on. Chuck shared a couple of ones. Many core values and truths are counterintuitive. What we want to do here is just spend a couple of minutes and apply a couple of principles. I want to talk about the counterintuitive nature of some truths and core values, and then Chuck wants to talk about another principle called the principle of self-deception. So as we inventory and identify our core values, we want you to think, and there are many other things to think about, but a couple of things. And one is core values and truths. Many of them are counterintuitive, and there's, punch that next one, should be that over here. I remember when I was in the Bible study, I just started my journey, this has been about 8 or 10 years ago. Glenn Price, who was in our men's group, told me that my greatest asset was my greatest weakness. And I looked at him and had one of those blank stares, because he knew a lot more about the Bible than I ever knew, that's for sure. But I want you to think about that. And as you identify your core value, can you accept the fact that perhaps your core value, one of your core values, your greatest asset is your greatest weakness? In my situation, that clearly is the case with the competitive aspect of it. It's caused me to achieve a lot of success and maybe a little bit of significance, but it's also opposed to that as well. And I have found that meeting those people who are type A and who are success-driven and achievers, then there's a backside to that, because they tend not to be compassionate. So a great strength always has a great weakness associated with it. And I've applied this principle to organizations as well. I know a couple organizations, and there's no need to discuss any of those, but I know a couple where their greatest strength as an organization is also a great weakness for them for various reasons. So I think that's a counterintuitive principle that I think is helpful. Next one. You are best served by serving others. These are just a couple of examples of counterintuitive points. How many of you, I think can we all agree that it is in serving others that we eventually are served? It is in loving others that we truly know how to be loved. Isn't that it? It's counterintuitive, but I think it relates to your search for core values. Another example? You cannot change the world until you change yourself. And I put a Mahatma Gandhi quote in here, but and I fall into this category. You know, we're going to take this organization from here to here, or we're going to take our business model from here to here. Now, you all go out and do that. You need to do that. You need to get sales, or we're going to change our mission statement. But sometimes what we forget is, and it relates to the core value analysis, and that is, you're not going to be able to change the world or an organization unless you change yourself first. And that's not something a lot of us want to admit to, but it is counterintuitive, and it is a reality. So, next principle is Price.
Well, it's a principle that I see oftentimes is the principle of self-deception. You know, and I've worked with a lot of people over the years, and a lot of people who thought they had it, and they were clueless at what was really going on in their life. You ever been there? I've been one of those people, but I've worked with a lot of people who've been there. one characteristic of self-deception that I've seen in people? The number one characteristic of a person who's self-deceived is they don't know that they're deceived. It's one of those, it's obvious, right? If they knew they were self-deceived, they'd deal with it, right? And you know, a lot of times people get so into, they want to make something work, and so they make all the data fit their narrative. We've got a good book that I use sometimes in coaching folks, and the title of the book is Why Smart Executives Fail. And this guy did a study of all these heads of global corporations over a period of several years who all, they tanked and made disastrous decisions, in some cases costing the company billions of dollars. And he goes down through and he talks about their skill set and their personal charisma, and they had all of that. How in the world did they jump off the cliff? It's because they became self-deceived. Whether they began to believe their own press or whatever, they didn't have people in their life that could speak truth to them. I mean, a whole number of reasons. But the gap, I think, oftentimes between our say and our do is probably one of the best barometers, if you will, or measure of our self-deception. The gap between our say and our do. And it's an interesting, maybe not the right choice of words, because it's painful sometimes to sit down and do kind of a self-evaluation of, you know, I've been saying to people in my public life all these various different things, but man, I know in my life that no one sees what I really do. And you begin to see that gap. And I think that's the thing that holds us up oftentimes between really embracing the key core values that will serve us well in getting to significance in our life. And the one thing that we haven't addressed yet, but as we go through this, at some point we want to discuss this together, because you know what the number one thing that we have lost in our culture in the last 10 years? We're losing our ability to have a contemplative life. We're losing our ability to have a contemplative life because we live in an entertainment culture. And it's so easy to be entertained because there's all those things. I was just flying the last week and I was on a number of different flights. Man, alive. People, they don't interact as much on planes as they used to. Everyone's plugged in, wired in, playing games, watching movies. And most of the stuff that I see isn't contemplative stuff that they're entertaining themselves with. And when we lose that ability to have a contemplative life, we begin to be much more susceptible to deceiving ourselves that things are working better for us than they're really working. And we can spend a lot of time there. But the gap between our say and our do is often the best measure of our self-deception. And our self-deception is a key factor in holding us back. Like core values, inventory in your core values. We're just going to use that. Boy, lunch is great, isn't it?
I think Sidney did $10 on the meal here, so thanks for that. We're going to use that to buy a new sound system and projector, I think. Okay, so we just thought we would invite you to take this sheet home with you, and I think work on it yourself. There's a lot of stuff out there in core values. What we tried to do is to come up with some ideas, some definitions for you. And what we'd like to have you do is to fill this out, and what you may want to do, I think I put a suggestion on there, you may want to run this by, make a photocopy of it and run this by your spouse, because it would be interesting to know what core values your spouse would say that you have based upon her perception of what you say and what you do. And compare that list to what you believe your core values are. I'm just saying it's interesting. I'm not saying I'm going to do it, but I probably will. So, and you know what? Whatever you decide in terms of that process is just fine. And then whatever you want to bring back here on January 16th would be great as well, because come to some consensus about core values, and try to look at both lists. Try to look at those values that support your journey, and maybe those core values that maybe oppose it. Let's go to the next one. So we've got a couple of little things to get. Okay, we've got some key questions, and these will help you, I think. And again, we'll send out some bullet points on this so that you'll have this information. But key questions about which you should ponder when you are making your list of core values. If you couldn't do what you're doing now, what would you do and why? We all feel somewhat, there are days when we really feel chained into our job or our profession, but maybe you don't. You know, maybe you're exactly where you want to be. But a key question is, if you could do what you're doing now, what would you do and why? Write the answer to that down before you do your core value inventory. Question number 2. What do you spend your leisure time doing? If it's not work, is it whatever it is? Watching ball games, is it on the internet? Are you a sports fanatic? Do you have a contemplative life? But make a note. Where does your leisure? If your core values were determined about where you spent your leisure time, honestly, what would your core values be? List them. Number 3, you spend your free moments thinking about what? Your thought process. Where does your mind go when you're not engaged at work? Where does your mind go? Your mind tends to go to, doesn't tend to go to what you want to do, what your dream is, where you want to be in 5 years. Make some thoughts about that. Spend your free moments thinking about what. And the last one, on what things do you spend your discretionary money? You've all heard of that one. That's an interesting concept. Go through your checkbook, see where you're spending your discretionary money, and is that a definition of your core values? I don't know. I squirmed in my chair when I thought about that. So I think those are 4 key values. Questions, that is, that will help you determine core values based on the definitions we have suggested to you, and based on the idea that, and embrace the idea that you will have some core values that are supporting your journey to significance, and there are some that are opposing it.
And today, what we're going to do is really plow some ground in our thinking to cultivate kind of our thinking about it. The next time we're together in January, we're going to begin to suggest what I think is a pretty good list, if you will, of what core values could be if we pursue that in our life. And that the key is having a biblical worldview. And we'll talk a little bit about that and how that can inform our growth. But I think what we want to do is allow some time for discussion around the tables. They did promise us that they were bringing food, so, but until we move into that, if we could just take a few moments around the tables, and if you could, what's that? Yeah, we could begin to talk about these questions, and I would be interested. The thing with core values, and I really struggled with this because there's several different lists of bullet points where I could show you love and compassion, and integrity, and so we could all click off all those lists. I had a thing that had like 30 different things that could be. Someone could say those are my core values, but are those really my core values? Is that where I really live? And so how do we expose what really is on our hearts? When I was in college, and the guy who began to work with me and mentor me took me through a book. It was a book written by a guy who had been in the Communist Party in England. And And the name of the book is Dedication and Leadership, written by Douglas Hyde. And Douglas Hyde he'd come out of the Communist Party and converted to Catholicism and made a huge impact on his life and turned him around. And he began to list out in the book Dedication and Leadership the level of commitment and dedication that they had in the Communist Party to what they believed in. And one of the things that he said in the book, and I've never forgotten it, he said, whatever captures a man's mind captures him, and thereby becomes his true objective. Whatever captures a man's mind captures him, and thereby becomes his true objective. And the point is that a lot of times it's really the core of who we are and those core values. If we have the right ones and we allow that to capture our mind, that'll be what we give our life to. So let's discuss that a few moments around the table in terms of these questions. Are there others that we could ask one another and ask ourselves that would help us get to what core values are? And I'm happy to put on the screen even the next time we get it, the typical list, but you all could come up with that. There's 30 or 40 of those kind of things that when we're sitting around the campfire, holding hands, singing Kumbaya,